My granddaughter wouldn't let go of my hand at the 4th of July cookout, and I almost missed it. She was 4 years old, small enough that her fingers barely wrapped around 2 of mine, and she'd been pressed against my leg for the better part of an hour. Kids get clingy at big gatherings. I know that. My wife kept saying it. My son-in-law kept saying it. But Maisie wasn't being clingy the way kids are clingy when they want attention or when they're tired. She was being clingy the way a person holds on to something when they're afraid of being swept away. I'm a high school history teacher, 31 years in the classroom, and before that, 2 years as a youth counselor at a residential facility outside of Columbus. I've worked with kids who've been through things that would make most adults shut down completely. I know what fear looks like on a child's face. I know the difference between a bad mood and something worse. My daughter Renata had set up the cookout at her place in Westerville. Their backyard was big enough, and she and her husband Garrett had done this every year since they moved in. Renata is my only child. I was 41 when she was born, one of those late-in-life surprises that rearranges everything you thought your life was going to be. She's 30 now, a dental hygienist, sharp and capable, and so much like her mother. It sometimes stops me cold. Garrett was 33, a project manager for a construction firm. They'd been married 4 years. Maisie was their only child. The cookout was loud the way these things always are. My wife Lorraine was at the picnic table talking with Renata's neighbor. Garrett's brother was there with his girlfriend. A few couples from the neighborhood, maybe 20 people total, that easy holiday noise of lawn chairs and kids running and the smell of charcoal. Maisie stayed at my leg. At one point I crouched down so I was at her level and said, "Hey, little bug, you want to go see if there are any fireflies hiding in the bushes over there?" It was early for fireflies, barely past 6, but she loved looking for them. She shook her head. "You hungry? Grandpa will get you some watermelon." She shook her head again. Then she leaned in very close to my ear, the way little kids do when they're sharing a tremendous secret, and she whispered, "I don't want to go in the garage." I pulled back to look at her face. "The garage, sweet pea. Nobody's going in the garage." She just looked at me, big dark eyes, very still. She didn't say anything else, but she moved closer. I stood up slowly. Garrett was at the grill laughing at something his brother had said. Renata was carrying a bowl of potato salad out from the kitchen. Normal. Completely normal. And yet something had just dropped into my chest like a stone. I told myself I was imagining things. Maisie was 4. 4-year-olds said things. They were afraid of drains and shadows and the vacuum cleaner. A garage was a perfectly reasonable thing to be nervous about. Maybe something had startled her in there once. A spider or a loud noise. I told myself that. I almost believed it. Later that evening, when most people had gone home and Lorraine was helping Renata clean up inside, I found Maisie sitting on the back porch step alone, turning a piece of sidewalk chalk over and over in her hands without drawing anything. Garrett had gone inside for more trash bags. I sat down beside her. "Hey," I said. "Hey, Grandpa. You have fun today?" She considered this seriously the way she considered most things. "Mostly," she said. I waited. Sometimes that's all you have to do with a child. Just wait. "Grandpa," she said finally, not looking at me. "Does it hurt to cry?" I felt my chest tighten. "What do you mean, sweetheart? When you try really hard not to? Does it hurt inside?" I put my arm around her. She was so small. "Yeah," I said honestly. "It does." She nodded like I'd confirmed something she already knew. "Maisie." I kept my voice gentle, easy. "Is somebody making you try not to cry?" The piece of chalk stopped moving in her hands. "Daddy says big girls don't cry about the garage," she whispered. "Daddy says it's our special thing, and I'm not supposed to tell Mommy because she'll be sad." The backyard went very quiet around me, even though nothing had changed. Same crickets. Same warm evening air. "What happens in the garage, Bug?" I asked. She shook her head fast. "I can't say. Daddy said if I tell, Mommy will go away." She looked up at me then. "I don't want Mommy to go away." Renata came to the back door. "Maisie, honey, time for your bath." Maisie stood up immediately. Too immediately, like a reflex. She went inside without looking at me again. I sat on that porch step for a long time after they went in. The fireflies had started coming out. I counted them without meaning to. 3, 5, 8. What Maisie had just described, a secret kept from her mother, The threat of losing her mother if she told, a specific place she was afraid of, a special thing with Daddy. I knew that pattern. I'd spent 2 years working with children who used that exact language. Not because anyone had taught them to describe it that way, but because that is the language that abusers use, distilled into the mouths of small children who are trying to survive. I drove home that night mostly in silence. Lorraine asked if I was feeling all right. I said I was tired. I spent the night not sleeping, staring at the ceiling, listing every reason I might be wrong. Maisie was imaginative. She had big feelings. The garage was full of Garrett's woodworking equipment. Loud and smelly, of course a 4-year-old might not like it. Maybe our special thing was a project they were building together, a birdhouse or something for Renata's birthday. Maybe I was a 60-year-old man who'd been around trauma too long and was now seeing it where it didn't exist. I listed all of those reasons. I gave them every fair hearing I could. And underneath all of them, steady as a drum beat, was a 4-year-old girl asking me if it hurts to try not to cry. The next morning, I called a former colleague from my youth counseling days. She'd gone on to become a licensed forensic interviewer for Franklin County. I didn't give her names. I laid out what Maisie had said, word for word, as exactly as I could remember it. I asked her what she thought. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know what you're describing." "I know," I said. "The secrecy component, the threat component, the location-specific fear. That's not nothing. I know. You can't unring this bell, Frank," she said. "Once you make a report, things happen that you can't control. Your daughter, her marriage. I know all of that." Another pause. "Then you already know what you have to do." Her name was Renata. My daughter. My only child. And what I was about to do could blow her entire life apart, based on the whispered words of a 4-year-old on a porch step. I understood that. I sat with it all morning. And then I thought about Maisie's hands, how they'd gone completely still when I asked what happened in the garage, and I picked up the phone. I didn't call the police first. I called my daughter. I've thought about that decision a lot since then. Whether I should have gone straight to authorities, bypassed the conversation entirely. My former colleague would probably say yes. But Renata was my child too, and if I was wrong, I wanted to give her the chance to tell me I was wrong before I detonated a bomb in the middle of her life. I asked if I could come over. I said I needed to talk to her alone. She said Garrett was at work, and Maisie was at her friend's house down the street. I drove over. She knew something was wrong the moment she saw my face. Renata has always been able to read me. She said, "Dad, what is it?" I told her what Maisie had said, every word. I watched my daughter's face while I talked. She didn't say what I expected her to say. She didn't defend Garrett or tell me I was misreading things. She went very white, very still, the way Maisie had gone, still on the porch step, and I realized with a cold horror that she'd been going still like that for a while. That I'd seen it and not quite registered it, the laugh that stopped too fast, the way she sometimes stepped back when Garrett walked into a room. Things I'd chalked up to the ordinary friction of marriage. "Renata," I said carefully, "has he ever? I don't know what goes on in that garage," she said. Her voice was flat in a way I'd never heard from her before. "He locks it. He's always locked it. He said it's where he keeps his tools and his projects, and I didn't want to." She stopped. Her hands were shaking. "Maisie won't go near it. I've been telling myself she just doesn't like the smell of the solvents." We sat in her kitchen for a while without speaking. Outside the window, the street was quiet, a normal Ohio summer morning. Someone watering their garden next door. "I need to see what's in there," I said. Renata had a spare key on the hook by the back door. Garrett had given it to her years ago and apparently forgotten about it because the lock hadn't been changed. She stood in the doorway while I went in. It took me less than 2 minutes to find it. The garage was organized in a particular way. The front half was Garrett's woodworking setup, a table saw and workbench and neatly hung tools. All of it legitimate, all of it exactly what a project manager who dabbled in woodworking would have. But there was a second door in the back, interior, padlocked. The padlock was new, expensive, not the kind you put on a storage room. I found the key in a coffee can on the second shelf, behind a row of wood stain cans. I don't know what I was expecting. I think part of me was still hoping I'd open it and find nothing. Christmas presents, maybe. An embarrassing hobby. What I found was a small room that had been converted from what was once a utility storage space. A child's sleeping bag on the floor. A tripod set up in the corner. A cable run from an extension cord to a small lamp. On a folding table, a lock box, and inside the box, I broke the hasp with a flathead screwdriver, a tablet, and a portable drive. I didn't look at the tablet. I didn't need to. I walked back into the garage, back into the morning light, and I called 911. I told the dispatcher that I believed my granddaughter had been abused and that I had found evidence in my son-in-law's garage. I said I was a former youth counselor and I understood what I was describing. I gave the address. The dispatcher told me to wait outside, to not touch anything else, and to make sure the gate was unlocked. 3 sheriff's deputies arrived within 7 minutes. 2 detectives came within 20. Renata was sitting on the back porch when they arrived, holding a coffee mug she hadn't drunk from, and she answered their questions in that same flat voice, the voice of someone who has already begun to understand something terrible. The lead detective was a woman named Detective Aldridge, early 40s, with the particular manner of someone who has seen enough of the world's worst to have become quietly efficient about it. She took my statement in the driveway while her partner went through the garage. When I finished, she asked me about Maisie's exact words twice, and I gave them to her exactly as I'd given them to my former colleague. "You preserved the scene," she said. "That helps." I broke a hasp. I said, "Exigent circumstances argument can be made. Your attorney can walk you through that if it comes to it." She looked at me steadily. "You did the right thing coming to us immediately. I went in there first. Most people do," she said, "the ones who love the child." Garrett was picked up at his office at 2:15 that afternoon. Renata was at the neighbor's house getting Maisie when it happened, which I was grateful for. The neighbor, a retired teacher named Mrs. Ochoa, kept Maisie inside watching cartoons while Renata spoke with a child welfare specialist in the driveway. I didn't see Maisie that day. The specialist said it would be better to let the forensic interview happen first to keep the family contact minimal until the process was clear. I understood that, but understanding it didn't make it easier to drive away from that street knowing my granddaughter was in there, possibly scared, possibly confused about why all these strangers were suddenly at her house. Garrett hired a private attorney within hours. He made no statements. He was composed when they brought him in. That's what Detective Aldridge told me later. That he'd been almost eerily composed, that he'd simply asked for his lawyer and said nothing after that. The forensic interview with Maisie was conducted 4 days later by a trained specialist at the Child Advocacy Center in Columbus. I wasn't there, obviously, but the social worker assigned to the case called me afterward and said that Maisie had disclosed fully that her account was consistent, specific, and corroborated by the physical evidence recovered from the tablet and the portable drive. It had been going on since she was 3. Renata moved back in with me and Lorraine within a week of the arrest. She didn't have a lot to take. She packed 2 suitcases for herself and a garbage bag full of Maisie's toys and stuffed animals, and she stood in the driveway of the house she'd lived in for 4 years and looked at it for a long moment and then got in the car. She didn't cry in front of me. She waited until we were on the highway and then she cried for most of the 40 minutes home, and I drove and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. Lorraine made up the guest room for Renata and the small room we'd used as an office for Maisie. She put a nightlight in the shape of a star on the bedside table because Maisie had one at home, and we weren't sure what she'd brought. When Maisie came in and saw the room, she walked around it slowly, touching things, the bookshelf, the curtains, the edge of the bed. Then she climbed up onto the bed, pulled a stuffed rabbit out of her bag and said, "Can I put Gerald here?" "Gerald can go wherever he wants," Lorraine said. Maisie set the rabbit very carefully against the pillow. "Okay," she said with a seriousness that cracked something in my chest. "Then I want to stay here too." The days that followed were not simple. Maisie had nightmares. She wet the bed twice, which her therapist said was a common regression and not to make an issue of it, so we didn't. She had a therapist, a gentlewoman with an office full of fidget toys and soft lighting, who saw her twice a week. She had a social worker. She had a court-appointed guardian ad litem whose job was to represent her interests through the legal process. She had more adults managing her care than most children see in a lifetime, and what she needed most was to feel like none of that was her fault. That part was the hardest. The guilt. About 3 weeks in, Maisie climbed into my lap while I was reading in the armchair and said, without preamble, "Grandpa, did I do something bad?" "No," I said, "not one thing, but Daddy went away because I told you. Daddy went away because Daddy did something he wasn't supposed to do. That's Daddy's fault, not yours." She thought about this. "Mrs. Waverly says that too. Mrs. Waverly is right. Do you think it's true?" I put down my book and turned so I could look at her directly. "Maisie, there is not one single piece of this that is your fault. Not telling me. Not Daddy going away. Not any of it. The only person responsible for what happened is the person who did it." She leaned her head against my chest and said, "Okay, Grandpa." She didn't fully believe me yet. That would take longer. But she was starting. The legal process moved slowly in the way these things do, with continuances and motions and hearings that kept getting pushed back. Garrett's attorneys tried to suppress the evidence from the tablet and the portable drive on Fourth Amendment grounds, arguing my entry into the secondary room violated the original scope of the search. The prosecution countered with exigent circumstances and Renata's ownership stake in the property as a marital asset. The judge sided with the prosecution. The evidence came in. They also tried to argue that Maisie's disclosure had been contaminated, that my conversation with her on the porch had coached her responses. The forensic interviewer testified for most of a morning about the protocols she'd used, about the open-ended questioning, about the specific details Maisie had provided that could not have been suggested by an elderly man asking, "What happens in the garage?" The jury watched the interview recording, all of it. Renata filed for divorce from prison visitation, which meant filing while Garrett was in the county jail awaiting trial. She sat across from him in a visitation room and told him she was ending their marriage, that he would have no contact with Maisie, that whatever happened in the courtroom was separate from this conversation. She told me later he'd said very little, that he'd looked at the table mostly, that at one point he'd said, "I thought you knew." She'd stood up and left without responding. She told me that in the car afterward, her voice still that flat, careful thing. And then she said, "Did I know, Dad? Is that possible?" "Could I have known and not you didn't know?" I said. "How can you be sure?" "Because you would have burned the garage down." She was quiet for a moment. Then she laughed, short and surprised, the first real laugh I'd heard from her in weeks. It wasn't funny, but it was true, and she knew it was true, and sometimes that's the thing you need to hear. The trial lasted 8 days. Garrett sat at the defense table with the same composure he'd had at his arrest, that same careful blankness. His attorneys were competent, and they tried everything they had, but the evidence was overwhelming. The portable drive alone contained documentation going back 11 months. The forensic examiner testified about file dates and metadata and the chain of custody. Maisie's guardian testified about her welfare. The forensic interviewer testified again. 2 expert witnesses on child psychology testified about disclosure patterns and trauma response. Garrett did not testify. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they came back, I was in the gallery beside Renata, who held my hand so tightly I couldn't feel my fingers by the end. On every count, guilty. The judge sentenced him to 38 years, possibility of parole after 25. His attorneys announced immediately that they would appeal. After the sentencing in the parking lot, Renata stood next to my car and just breathed for a while. I didn't rush her. The sky was doing something beautiful, one of those late afternoon Ohio skies in autumn where the light goes gold before it goes gray, and we stood in it for a few minutes before she said anything. "I keep thinking about all the things I told myself," she said. "Every time something felt off. Every time Maisie was too quiet or Garrett was too, I don't know, careful. Every time I made myself an explanation and moved on." "You protected her the moment you knew," I said. "I should have known sooner." "Maybe. Maybe not. Renata, he hid it from you deliberately. He built systems to hide it from you. That's not your failure, that's his." She nodded slowly. She didn't entirely believe me yet, either, but she was starting. The appeals failed. Every one of them. The evidence held. Garrett's sentence held. He is currently serving his term at a correctional facility in the southern part of the state, and as far as I know, Renata has had no contact with him since that day in the visitation room, and Maisie has never had to see him again. That was 4 years ago. Maisie is 8 now. She still sees a therapist, though less frequently than before, once a month, mostly for check-ins. She has 2 best friends at school, a dog we adopted last spring named Biscuit, and an absolute obsession with anything involving marine biology, which means our house currently contains 4 library books about octopuses and a poster of bioluminescent creatures she made for a school project. She gets nightmares sometimes, less than before, but sometimes. When that happens, she comes down the hall and knocks on the guest room door where her mother sleeps, or she comes to my door, and we sit together until it passes. Renata still lives with us. She's not ready to be somewhere else yet, and we're not ready for her to be. And Maisie is not ready, and that is fine. The house is different than it was, louder, more complicated. A dog underfoot, a second grader's artwork covering the refrigerator. Lorraine says it's the best the house has ever been. I think she's right. I've had people ask me if I hesitated, if I thought about whether I was wrong, about what I'd be doing to my daughter's marriage, her life, if I was misreading a child's words, and the honest answer is yes. I thought about all of that, all night and into the next morning. I gave every alternate explanation its full consideration, but here's what I've come to understand. After 31 years in classrooms and 2 years in residential care and 4 years watching my granddaughter learn how to be a child again, a child who tells you a secret about a place where something hurts her and then goes rigid when her name is called, and then asks you if it hurts to try not to cry. That child is asking you for something. Not explicitly, not with the words she doesn't have yet, but she is asking. The only question is whether you're paying attention. I was 60 years old and retired the spring after the trial. I spend my days driving Maisie to school and back, watching Biscuit chase squirrels he will never catch, and occasionally being recruited for octopus-related homework emergencies. Last month, Maisie asked me to come speak to her second-grade class about what teachers do. I stood in front of 27-year-olds and talked about paying attention, about how the most important thing any grown-up can do is notice when a kid is trying to tell them something, even when the words aren't quite there yet. Afterward, walking back to my car, Maisie took my hand the way she had at that 4th of July cookout 4 years earlier. But it was different this time. It wasn't the grip of a child holding on out of fear. It was just her hand in mine. Easy and warm, the way it's supposed to be. "You did good, Grandpa," she told me. "You did better," I said. "You were the brave one." She thought about that. We were both brave, she decided, with the particular authority of an 8-year-old who has considered the matter and reached a fair conclusion. "Yeah," I said. "We were." That's the thing nobody tells you about moments like the one I had on that porch step. They don't feel like choices when they're happening. They feel like the only possible thing to do, the only direction that's still open, the only way to live with yourself afterward. You don't think, "I'm deciding to save her." You think, "She told me something and I heard it." But I've talked to enough survivors, in classrooms, in community groups, in the quiet aftermath of disclosures, to know that not everyone gets heard. Not every child has someone paying attention at that exact moment. Not every family gathering has someone who knows what to look for, who stays when the room gets uncomfortable, who sits down on the porch step and just waits. If you know a child in your life who has gone quiet in a way they didn't used to be quiet, who flinches at a name or a place, who says strange things about secrets or special things or what will happen if they tell, don't explain it away. Don't wait for certainty you may never have. Ask the question gently and then listen, really listen to what comes back. You might be wrong. I hope you're wrong. But if you're not, that child needs you to be paying attention right now, in this moment, before one more thing happens that they'll spend the rest of their life trying to recover from. Maisie still has Gerald the rabbit on her pillow. She's had him since she was 2. He's missing an eye, and one of his ears is mostly unstuffed, and she loves him unreasonably, the way children love the things that were with them through the worst of it. She told me once that Gerald knows all her secrets because he was there. "Is that okay?" she asked. "That he knows?" "That's exactly okay," I told her. "That's what Gerald is for." She smiled at that, a full, uncomplicated smile, the kind that takes up her whole face. I keep that smile with me. On the hard days when the guilt still finds me, the hours I didn't act, the 4th of July she spent, afraid while I made myself alternate explanations. I remember that smile, and I remember what her therapist told me early on. When I was sitting in her waiting room, barely holding it together, you cannot change what happened before you knew. You can only change what happens after. So that's what I did. That's what we're still doing. Every day, one ordinary morning at a time. I still think about the version of that evening where I let it go, where I told myself Maisie was just being a 4-year-old overtired and clingy, and I went home and watched the news and went to bed. That version exists. I almost lived it. And what I understand now, in a way I couldn't have put into words before all of this, is that the gap between that version and the one I actually chose wasn't courage in any dramatic sense. It was just attention. Paying attention to a child who was trying in the only language she had to tell me something true. There's a cause and effect logic to what happened that I find myself tracing backwards sometimes. Garrett made choices consistently over years that he believed were hidden. What he didn't account for was a little girl loved her grandfather enough to press her face against my leg for an entire afternoon and ask me at the end of it whether it hurts to hold crying inside. That question was the thread. And once I heard it, really heard it, not explained it away, everything that followed was almost inevitable. The right things happened because the right thing was done first. It's not more complicated than that, even when it felt impossibly complicated in the middle of it. What I wish I could tell every person watching this is that what I did didn't require anything extraordinary. It required 3 things that I think most of us already have somewhere in us if we're willing to use them. The first is knowing right from wrong when it matters. Not in the easy cases, but in the ones where acting means losing something or hurting someone you love. I didn't want to blow up Renata's life. I didn't want to be wrong about my own son-in-law. Doing the right thing anyway, even when it costs you, even when you're not certain. That's the only version of integrity that actually counts. The second is thinking clearly under pressure. I had a child's whispered words in a locked door and a sleepless night. I didn't have proof. What I had was 30 years of watching children, a memory I trusted, and the discipline to think through what I was actually seeing instead of what I wanted to see. That kind of clarity, the willingness to look hard at a situation and call it what it is, isn't a gift some people are born with. It's a practice. It's choosing, over and over, to be honest with yourself even when dishonesty would be more comfortable. The third is the one Maisie taught me. She was 4 years old and she had been carrying something no child should carry, and she found a way to say it anyway. Quietly, sideways, in a question about whether crying hurts. That is the definition of grit, not the absence of fear, but moving through it anyway, toward the one person she thought might help. I think about her courage every time my own feels thin. Maisie is 8 now. She has a dog and a rabbit named Gerald, and strong opinions about octopuses, and some morning she comes to find me before school just to show me something she noticed, a weird cloud, a bug on the windowsill, some fact she read. Those mornings are the whole point. Those mornings are what was almost lost. You can't go back and change the before. None of us can. But you can decide right now to be the person who pays attention. The one who sits down on the porch step and waits. The one who hears the thing that's being said underneath the words. That's all it was. That's everything it was.